Over Ilhan Omar. Linked to terrorism, Pam Bondi reveals shocking evidence. In a historic moment that reverberated through the halls of the U.S. Capitol, Ilhan Omar, the Democratic representative from Minnesota, stood accused of treason and multiple other serious charges. The allegations were as explosive as they were shocking. Omar, once a beacon for progressive politics, was now facing the prospect of being stripped of her congressional seat. In a swift and unexpected turn, the House Ethics Committee voted overwhelmingly to recommend her removal from office. The vote was a staggering 80% in favor of her expulsion, a political earthquake that stunned the nation. The reason: her alleged involvement in a series of actions that undermined national security and supported individuals engaged in acts of terrorism. Before diving into the specifics of the charges, it's important to understand the weight of the damage inflicted on the United States by the terrorist attack that brought these allegations to light. In Boulder, Colorado, an illegal immigrant entered the country under the Biden administration with a tourist visa, only to later turn into a living nightmare for the American public. 3 years after his arrival, this man, with 14 unlit Molotov cocktails, staged a premeditated assault against innocent civilians, Jewish people simply attending a memorial to honor Israeli hostages. The violence was horrific, the hatred palpable. The attack was not just a random act of violence, it was a targeted terrorist assault, aimed at the Jewish community. As shocking as the attack was, what followed was perhaps even more astonishing. The individual responsible was not only allowed to remain in the country, but was protected by certain high-profile figures, including Ilhan Omar. A web of intrigue, cover-ups, and deeply troubling political maneuvers was now at the center of a full-fledged national crisis. Reports surfaced that Ilhan Omar personally intervened to protect the suspect, ensuring he would be returned to Israel without facing charges in the U.S. The legal loopholes were clear. U.S. law didn't apply on Israeli soil, so the suspect who had been caught in the act would effectively walk free. The political implications were severe. Omar, a sitting congresswoman, allegedly used her power and influence to ensure that an individual accused of terrorism would not face the full consequences of U.S. law. The move sparked a national outcry. How could a sitting representative aid a criminal in evading justice? How could a lawmaker engage in such actions, especially when national security was at stake? This, however, wasn't just about a single individual's actions. This was about the systemic rot that allowed such acts to take place, and the complicit behavior of those in power who stood by and did nothing. In the weeks following the revelations, the FBI and DOJ launched a comprehensive investigation into Ilhan Omar. Pam Bondi, a seasoned prosecutor, known for her sharp legal mind, took center stage in the courtroom. Bondi had been investigating Omar for months, compiling damning evidence from sources within U.S. immigration and FBI intelligence. Alongside her, Thomas Homan, the former director of ICE, lent his expertise to the case, offering crucial testimony about the visa fraud that had allowed the terrorist to enter the country in the first place. Homan's involvement was pivotal. He had long been outspoken about the broken immigration system and was determined to ensure that those who violated U.S. law faced justice no matter their political affiliation. Bondi's argument was simple. Ilhan Omar, as a member of Congress, had used her office to protect an individual engaged in terrorist activity. She had circumvented the law, undermined national security, and played a dangerous game with the lives of innocent civilians. The evidence Bondi presented was both shocking and irrefutable. Along with FBI intelligence, she introduced documents that linked Omar to a broader network of terror evidence of financial dealings and political favors that suggested Omar wasn't just a passive player. She was actively involved in facilitating terrorist activities on U.S. soil. The investigation into Omar's actions began to reveal disturbing details about the broader scope of the cover-up. According to sources within the Department of Justice, there were allegations that Omar had been involved in international money laundering schemes linked to USAID, a U.S. government-funded program that had inadvertently funneled money to groups associated with terrorist organizations. The FBI investigation also revealed that Omar had been in direct communication with several high-ranking officials in Hamas and other radical organizations. Reports surfaced that she had been using her position to influence U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She had allegedly been acting as a liaison for Palestinian interests within Congress, leveraging her influence to push policies that directly conflicted with U.S. national security interests. In response to the charges, Omar and her team mounted a fierce defense. They claimed that the accusations were politically motivated, a way to discredit her and undermine the progressive movement within the U.S. government. But the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Omar's defense also argued that her actions were in line with her values, as a representative asserting that her efforts were intended to foster peace and protect the rights of the oppressed. However, this argument quickly unraveled in court, as the DOJ's evidence painted a much darker picture. In her closing remarks, Pam Bondi delivered a sharp rebuke of Omar's defense. "This isn't about ideology," Bondi said. "This is about the rule of law. This is about protecting American citizens." Ilhan Omar's actions went beyond mere political disagreement. They were a direct violation of the trust placed in her by the American people. As the trial heated up, Thomas Homan took the stand, providing crucial testimony about the flaws in the U.S. immigration system that allowed the terrorists to enter the country under the Biden administration. He explained the numerous gaps in the visa process that had been exploited to grant entry to individuals with known terrorist affiliations. The jury, made up of a mix of political independents, Republicans, and liberal-leaning citizens, watched in rapt attention as the trial unfolded. Ilhan Omar, for the first time in her career, was on the defensive. As the trial against Ilhan Omar unfolded, the FBI and DOJ uncovered a shocking web of connections, linking her to organizations and individuals with ties to terrorism. The investigation, led by Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan, revealed that Omar's actions weren't just limited to the terrorist suspect she had protected. Instead, they uncovered a network of questionable associations and financial transactions that raised serious questions about her true intentions. One of the most startling discoveries was the paperwork found in the suspect's vehicle. Along with 14 unlit Molotov cocktails, agents uncovered documents linking the suspect to USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. USAID, a federal program meant to provide humanitarian aid, was now under suspicion for being a facade for money laundering operations tied to terrorist groups. According to Thomas Homan, former director of ICE, these documents provided undeniable evidence that U.S. taxpayer dollars were being funneled into Hamas-controlled areas, further destabilizing the region. The links to Ilhan Omar were not just circumstantial. The investigation revealed that Omar had been in contact with high-ranking officials involved in these operations. She had used her position to influence U.S. foreign policy, pushing for policies that undermined U.S. interests and supported Palestinian groups that were known to have violent factions. These revelations sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the nation. Despite mounting evidence, Ilhan Omar continued to deny any wrongdoing. Her defense team claimed that the charges were a political attack, an effort to discredit her and undermine her efforts to advocate for marginalized communities. Omar's allies in Congress and her supporters in the media rallied behind her, claiming that the investigation was part of a broader effort to silence progressive voices in the U.S. government. But the evidence presented by Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan painted a much different picture. The FBI's findings were irrefutable. Omar had used her congressional office to aid individuals involved in terrorist activity. More importantly, the documents showing her involvement in USAID-linked operations raised serious concerns about her role in the broader international funding network that had been funneled into regions controlled by terrorist organizations. The question now was no longer whether she had committed these acts. The question was why she had done it. What was her ultimate goal? Was it ideological, a belief in supporting Palestinian causes at any cost, or was there something far more sinister at play? As the trial continued, the public opinion on Ilhan Omar began to shift. The revelation of her connections to Hamas and the U.S. taxpayer funds that had been redirected to terrorist organizations stirred outrage among many Americans. Critics argued that Omar's actions were not just a violation of U.S. law, but also a betrayal of the trust the American people had placed in her as a public servant. On the other hand, her supporters doubled down on their defense of her. They claimed that the trial was a distraction, a way for those in power to suppress voices, advocating for justice and equity. They pointed to the hate crime committed by the terrorist as a justification for Omar's actions, claiming that she was only trying to protect the rights of oppressed people. The division grew deeper. Proponents of Omar's expulsion argued that justice had to prevail regardless of political affiliation. They pointed to her intervention in the terrorist case as a clear sign that she was complicit in allowing a terrorist to operate freely within U.S. borders. But others saw the case as an example of political gamesmanship with accusations of bias and an overzealous prosecution aiming to bring down a woman who had stood up against the establishment. In the midst of the trial, Pam Bondi presented the economic and human cost of Omar's actions. The numbers were staggering. Not only had the terrorist attack in Boulder, Colorado, led to multiple fatalities and widespread injuries, but the larger impact on national security was immeasurable. The terrorist suspect had been able to act with near impunity thanks to Ilhan Omar's interference. According to FBI reports, the number of terror-related incidents in the United States had steadily increased since Omar took office. Investigators found that many of these incidents were connected to illegal immigrants who had entered the country during Biden's administration under lax border policies. The fact that this specific terrorist had entered under Omar's watch added a personal and emotional weight to the trial. As the evidence stacked up, many began to question whether Ilhan Omar's actions were a result of political ideology or a deeper, more troubling connection to terrorist networks. Bondi and Homan were determined to find the truth and bring it to light no matter where it led. As the trial reached its climax, all eyes were on the jury. The case against Ilhan Omar had never been clearer. The evidence against her was overwhelming: terrorism, links, illegal immigration violations, foreign influence, and betrayal of U.S. interests. But despite the evidence, there remained a question: what should happen to her? Should Ilhan Omar face expulsion from Congress, or should she face criminal charges for her alleged involvement in national security breaches? The jury deliberated for hours, and as the final verdict loomed, the nation held its breath. The stakes were high, not just for Omar, but for the future of American politics and the ongoing debate about immigration, national security, and the role of elected officials. The courtroom was silent, the tension almost palpable. All eyes were on the jury as they prepared to deliberate on the fate of Ilhan Omar. Pam Bondi had presented her case with clarity and conviction, detailing how Omar's actions had allowed a terrorist to evade justice, how her involvement in terrorism-linked operations had endangered American lives, and how her interference had exposed national security vulnerabilities. It was now up to the jury to decide if Omar's career in Congress was over, or if she would walk free. The clock ticked, and outside the courthouse, the nation awaited the outcome. Supporters of Omar rallied outside, chanting for justice and decrying what they saw as a politically motivated attack. Meanwhile, her critics were confident that this was the moment that the rule of law would prevail. For Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Bondi had poured everything into proving Omar's culpability. She wasn't just fighting for justice for the victims of the Boulder attack. She was fighting for the integrity of the U.S. government itself. If Omar was allowed to walk free, what message would that send about the country's commitment to justice? After hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman stood and with a heavy heart delivered their verdict. Ilhan Omar was found guilty of treason, aiding and abetting terrorists, and violating U.S. national security. The room erupted into a mixture of applause and gasps. For many, this was a long overdue reckoning for a politician whose actions had in their eyes undermined the very fabric of the nation. Omar's expression remained stoic, but her eyes betrayed a flash of anger. She had anticipated this moment, but the reality was still a bitter pill to swallow. She had been expelled from Congress, her career and political future shattered. The decision was historic, not just for its political ramifications, but because it marked the first time in U.S. history that a sitting Congresswoman had been expelled for committing treasonous acts. This case wasn't just about one woman's misdeeds. It was about setting a precedent for accountability, ensuring that those in power would no longer be allowed to compromise the safety of the American people for their own political or ideological gain. With the verdict handed down, the political fallout was swift and unforgiving. The expulsion of Ilhan Omar rocked the political landscape. The Democratic Party was forced to confront a massive scandal that could tarnish their reputation for years to come. Progressives who had once seen Omar as a symbol of change and resistance to the establishment now found themselves grappling with the reality that their champion had become a liability. Republican leaders, meanwhile, were quick to seize the moment. Donald Trump issued a statement praising the jury's decision and calling it a victory for the American people. "Today, justice has been served," Trump said. "The corruption in Washington is being exposed, and we will continue to fight for a government that serves the people, not special interests." But the implications of the trial went beyond party lines. The case had ignited a fierce debate about the role of elected officials in safeguarding the nation's security. While some hailed the conviction as a necessary step to hold corrupt politicians accountable, others feared that it was a dangerous precedent that could be used to silence political opponents in the future. The political tension in Washington reached a fever pitch as both sides rallied their supporters for what was sure to be a contentious battle in the weeks and months ahead. As the guilty verdict settled in the next phase of the trial began sentencing. The prosecution had made it clear that Ilhan Omar should face the harshest possible penalties for her actions. Given the gravity of the charges, there were calls for life imprisonment, or even the death penalty for her role in aiding terrorist groups. However, a new and unexpected complication emerged. Ilhan Omar's defense team argued that she should be sent back to her home country Somalia to face trial there for her actions, as she had strong ties to the nation and could claim political asylum. The defense also posited that since her actions involved international terrorism, the U.S. legal system might not have jurisdiction over some of her actions, especially those that occurred outside the country. This argument sparked outrage. Thomas Homan and Pam Bondi countered with a blistering response, pointing out that Omar had taken an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution, not to protect foreign interests or fund terrorist groups. Homan in particular made an impassioned plea. "This isn't about a political issue. This is about our national security. Ilhan Omar betrayed the American people. She cannot be allowed to evade justice." In the days following the verdict, Ilhan Omar filed an appeal to overturn the expulsion and conviction. Her lawyers argued that the evidence presented against her was circumstantial and politically motivated. They also tried to exploit legal loopholes to delay the process, with Omar herself remaining defiant in public appearances. She accused her opponents of using her expulsion as a political tool, and her rhetoric began to shift toward a more aggressive stance. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The FBI was moving forward with its investigation into her connections to terrorist networks and foreign interference, while Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan worked tirelessly to ensure that Omar was held accountable for her actions. The case was far from over, and many saw this as just the beginning of a larger reckoning with the influence of foreign actors in U.S. politics. As the trial of Ilhan Omar drew to a close, Americans from all walks of life began to weigh in on the implications of the verdict. For some, it was a victory for justice, proof that no one, not even an elected official, was above the law. For others, it was a wake-up call about the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths to which some would go to undermine the nation's security. But one thing was clear: the trial had exposed a deep divide within the American political system, one that went beyond party lines. The aftermath of the trial would likely shape the country's political landscape for years to come. As Ilhan Omar faced the fallout from her expulsion, the investigation into her actions was far from over. The appeal she filed to overturn the conviction didn't silence the storm of controversy surrounding her. On the contrary, it only fueled it, intensifying the scrutiny of her political career and actions. Behind the scenes, the FBI and DOJ continued to build their case, uncovering new layers of evidence that painted an even darker picture of the embattled Congresswoman's involvement in international terrorism and foreign interference. Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan were relentless in their pursuit of justice. They knew that the stakes had never been higher. If Ilhan Omar were allowed to escape consequences for her actions, it would set a dangerous precedent for how foreign influence and terrorism could infiltrate U.S. politics. They had to ensure that the full extent of her betrayal was revealed to the American people. As the legal wrangling continued, the FBI uncovered new evidence that further implicated Ilhan Omar in a network of foreign terrorism funding. According to confidential FBI reports, Omar had been in regular contact with Hamas-linked individuals, and her political actions had often aligned with their goals. In addition to the documentation already presented in court, investigators found encrypted communications that suggested Omar had been actively facilitating the movement of funds to terrorist organizations under the guise of humanitarian aid. Thomas Homan, a key player in the investigation, spoke to the media about the depth of Omar's involvement. "We're not just talking about one bad decision. We're talking about a pattern of behavior actions that jeopardize the safety of American citizens. Ilhan Omar isn't just another politician who made a mistake. She actively worked against our nation's best interests." Homan revealed that the USAID documents found in the terrorist's vehicle, initially thought to be just coincidental, were part of a much larger operation. Omar's direct ties to U.S. taxpayer-funded foreign aid and her ability to steer that money toward Hamas-controlled regions had raised the stakes even higher. The investigation revealed evidence of intentional misdirection of funds, amounting to millions of dollars that had been diverted from aid programs to further terrorist agendas. Despite mounting evidence, Ilhan Omar's allies in Congress continued to rally behind her, claiming that the investigation was politically motivated. Supporters from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party insisted that Omar had been targeted because of her vocal criticism of the U.S. government and her outspoken stance on Palestinian rights. To them, the charges were part of a larger effort to silence their movement and weaken Muslim voices in American politics. But this defense did little to sway the public opinion. In fact, as the trial progressed, more and more Americans began to view Omar's actions with suspicion. Many believed that her loyalties were to a foreign cause rather than to the nation she swore to protect. The revelations about her role in the terrorist attack in Boulder, the terrorists' escape from justice, and her involvement in foreign financial operations had painted her as a threat to national security. Omar's political defenders, however, continued to focus on her free speech and humanitarian work. They argued that Omar was simply trying to help the oppressed Palestinian people and had never intended to support terrorism. But as more evidence surfaced, it became clear that Omar's actions had been far from innocent. Pam Bondi, in her closing arguments, painted a stark picture. It's not just about a congresswoman's ideology, it's about her betrayal of the American people. She didn't just speak out for what she believed in, she acted against the very security that her position was supposed to protect. Despite the increasing evidence, Ilhan Omar maintained her innocence, rejecting every accusation against her. In an emotional address to the public, Omar claimed that the entire investigation was an effort to undermine her political career and vilify her as a scapegoat for the failings of the current administration. She asserted, "I stand by my principles. I fight for the oppressed. I fight for justice. And if that makes me a target, then so be it. But I will not back down. I will not be silenced." Her defiance was not well received by many in the political establishment, especially Thomas Homan, who had spent months painstakingly building the case against her. In a press briefing, Omar stated, "Her words don't change the facts. The evidence speaks for itself. Ilhan Omar is not a martyr. She's a criminal who has put our national security at risk." Meanwhile, Pam Bondi continued to press for the maximum penalty expulsion from Congress, followed by criminal charges that would hold Omar accountable for her actions, including her attempt to protect the terrorist and her role in funding radical groups. Bondi argued that Omar's defiance only made it more urgent to send a message to others who might attempt to exploit the system in the same way. As the trial progressed, more questions began to emerge about the forces behind Ilhan Omar's political rise. Sources close to the investigation began to point fingers at those who had enabled her. Political benefactors in both the U.S. and the Middle East had worked tirelessly to build Omar's profile, ensuring she was seen as a voice for progressive change. But were they also working behind the scenes to protect her when things went south? One major concern was the influence of foreign actors. Allegations surfaced that Omar had been influenced by foreign money, channeled through organizations that masked their true intentions under the guise of humanitarian aid. These organizations had been linked to Hamas and other radical groups, and the financial tracks led straight to Omar's office. For many, the question became clear: had Omar's radical views always been her own, or had she been groomed by foreign powers to push a specific agenda that went against the interests of the United States? As the investigation moved forward, more light was shed on these questions, though the answers remained elusive. As the legal battle continued, the stakes only got higher. The question on everyone's mind was, what would happen next? Could Ilhan Omar successfully evade the consequences of her actions, or would she face the full weight of justice? The courtroom drama was far from over. In Part 5, the investigation would take another shocking turn as Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan unearthed even more explosive evidence that linked Ilhan Omar to high-ranking figures within the Democratic Party and foreign terrorist networks. Would justice finally be served, or would political influence once again tip the scales in her favor? As the trial continued, Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan unearthed more explosive evidence that deepened the conspiracy surrounding Ilhan Omar. It was no longer just about her personal involvement in the terrorist incident in Boulder, Colorado, or her attempts to evade U.S. law by protecting the suspect. Now it was clear that Omar's ties to foreign terrorist organizations were far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The FBI uncovered a treasure trove of classified documents linking Ilhan Omar to high-level figures within Hamas and other extremist groups. These documents, obtained through careful forensics, detailed financial transactions, covert meetings, and coordinated actions that pointed directly to Omar's role in facilitating terrorist activities under the guise of humanitarian work. The USAID funding she had been accused of misdirecting to Hamas was just the tip of the iceberg. Further investigation revealed that Omar's connections weren't limited to foreign entities. A series of leaked communications showed her colluding with powerful figures within the Democratic Party who had enabled her rise to power and covered for her actions when the allegations began to surface. Some of the most shocking revelations pointed to high-ranking political figures who had been aware of her controversial activities and had helped protect her from full scrutiny. As Bondi and Homan presented their findings, it became increasingly clear that Ilhan Omar had used her congressional position not only to influence foreign policy, but also to orchestrate financial deals that directly benefited terrorist groups. Her actions were not only criminal, but represented a breach of national security so deep it threatened to unravel the integrity of the U.S. government itself. Despite mounting evidence, Omar remained defiant. Her legal team pushed forward with their appeal, but it was becoming evident that the walls were closing in. Bondi and Homan continued to apply pressure, determined to see justice served. With each new revelation, the case against Ilhan Omar grew more compelling. The political fallout from the trial reached new heights, with Democratic leaders scrambling to defend their party's image while Republicans rallied around the push for accountability. As the trial neared its conclusion, all eyes were on the next steps. Would Ilhan Omar face criminal prosecution, or would she escape into the political shadows, once again protected by her powerful allies? The investigation was now broader than just her personal culpability. It was about exposing the corruption that had allowed her to thrive in a system that had failed to hold her accountable. As the trial reached its climax, Ilhan Omar faced the inevitable truth. Despite her best efforts to evade accountability, the mountain of evidence presented by Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan left little room for doubt. Her involvement in terrorist financing and her betrayal of national security were now undeniable. The final verdict loomed, and it would determine not only her political future, but also the integrity of the U.S. government. The jury deliberated quickly. In a landmark decision, Ilhan Omar was expelled from Congress and convicted of treason and terrorism-related charges. The political shockwaves reverberated across Washington as her allies in the Democratic Party scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. In the wake of her conviction, Omar's defense unraveled. The trial's outcome marked the end of a chapter of corruption that had plagued U.S. politics. The case had not only exposed Ilhan Omar's betrayal, but had also sent a clear message: no one is above the law, no matter their political stature. Though the nation remained divided, Pam Bondi and Thomas Homan had achieved what many thought impossible. Ilhan Omar had been held accountable, and the political machine that protected her was exposed for all to see.